It's that time again, everyone. It is animation dissection time. Of course, I am Nixie here with the Zorak, the one and only.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing all right. Getting ready for summer. Getting ready for the heat. I'm already wearing an ice pack on my head as we speak.
The heat's already here. In the desert, the heat's always already here.
It never ends. Why did you move there?
Hey, man.
I mean, yes, there's really cool lizards. There's some scorpions. Maybe a toad.
Zorak gotta get paid.
That you're right.
Gotta get
anyway. Well, now that I am free from the clutches of Persona 5, I'm ready to watch cartoons again.
You said that last time.
Yes, I did. I said that last time, but it never ends. The memes don't stop. They don't stop. You must be tired. Anyway, so we're going to be talking about Daria today, but before that, we got to go through the news.
Yeah, so I've got a few things for the news today. So the first one is that Kadokawa, one of the major Japanese publishers that publishes both a bunch of novels and light novels and manga in Japan, and as a result, end up influencing a lot of the Japanese animation that ends up being produced, adapting that material, recently put out a ban on a certain genre of story.
And what genre is that, Zorak?
It's the isekai or isekai narratives, the ones where you just have the teens being transported to fantasy worlds, because it's been overdone. There's too many of them, and they pretty much suck.
It's almost like the whole postmodern navel-gazing thing can become annoying somehow.
Right. And they kept on getting too many pitches for that, and they just kept on having too much of that material.
Well, I don't know if they're banning it entirely. I think it's because they're holding a contest, right? They hold the competition they hold, which is kind of how they recruit their next stock of writers, and they're pre-banning those subjects. Sure. Also, teen protagonists. They're going to try to go for an older market, which is kind of nice to see. Kadokawa in the past, before, were kind of known for publishing a lot of darker material.
Yeah, and like you said, it's not as crazy as them doing a complete ban, no more. But this is also kind of indicative of a kind of a general trend and a general opinion that they have on their general trajectory, in the sense that their audience is aging up. And perhaps going towards the same teen-focused thing is a little stayed. You have to evolve. You have to keep things going. And while you could just try chasing trends when they pop up elsewhere, as it often shows, it often pays to create trends by being innovative and creative.
Well, I'm also a big fan of the idea of, hey, a lot of teenagers like material that's not directed at teens. Who'd have thunk? That could also be an opportunity.
Sure, and some of this ties back to the oddness of Japanese, culture when it comes to the nostalgia that's held for high school days as the only days when you had any freedom at all in your life, any sense of choice.
Which is ironic because college is that for them.
Yeah, it's very strange that college is not mentioned at all, when it is basically hey, you get to college and you just do fuck all. Which, that's the weird thing. Although, as we might get into, high school experiences vary, but yeah. Sure. And, it's not strictly the case that is the only thing going on. And I'm sure there's appeal to, it's not literally everybody in Japan is just high school's great, adulthood sucks. It's just a general trend that's appeared predominantly in light novels and manga.
Well, it's the same way that a lot of shows that are made for kids, they assume that the main characters and casts have to be children. And I think in the past, there have been times when that hasn't been true. Look at things like Rocko's Modern Life. Those, it's a kid's cartoon. Kids were still able to appreciate it, but the cast were adults. I'd say Regular Show and various other ones. I think there's this strange assumption that people will only like and understand material that has their own demographics written into it, is kind of a faulty assumption. Of course, this is not to argue in favor of not allowing for a representation of a wide variety of audiences.
Oh, sure.
But the idea that, well, kids will only watch stuff that has kids as the main characters in it is kind of a very limited view on the potential of the medium and the intelligence, I think, of the audience, to be frank.
Sure. And a lot of this just ties back to the fact that the Japanese animation market, like, as it turns out, every media market in the entire world, is not very big on risk-taking. And once they find a trend that works, they stick to it until someone else proves that a divergence can work. And then rather than people going like, oh, we should take risks, they go, we're going to do that.
Yay, capitalism!
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, anyways, moving on. There was a trailer that went up for that Castlevania Netflix thing.
Yes, I actually have a friend who works on it. So
doesn't look half bad.
Yeah. Well, I think as I had mentioned before, I knew the visuals were at least going to be okay because, again, I knew a little bit of the background going into it. Sorry, I didn't talk more about it, but I didn't want to leak. But I'm excited visually. It's going to be really interesting, I think. So I'm unfortunately not too familiar with the Castlevania series beyond a few of the things that I have watched in terms of playthroughs of it. I don't know how rich the story and narrative that they're basing it on is, so I can't speak to expectations on that end. But
I can.
Well, you can, but you're not me now, are you?
Not yet.
Oh God, I'm locking my door.
I'm gonna wear your skin, Nixie.
Why would you want
You're
my
gonna be a
life?
giant glove for my body.
I want you inside of my skin. No, but in terms of visuals, I'm really excited for it because it is a U.S. production and they're doing stuff that doesn't look like, U.S. productions currently, which I'm really excited for.
It looks
because
like an anime, kind of, in terms of, the general action style, or, at least in the sense
I mean, the depth
it's
of
a character action series, which it's not strictly just anime, but traditionally that's been kind of the case.
Well, that's kind of that's because the
thing.
U.S. has kind of given up on doing stuff like that. So anime kind of, hey, there's an opening, it filled the space. It's like water. Anime is like water. It sustains life, and it fills the space. It will flow to spaces.
It's full of uranium.
Sometimes fish
That's why
pee.
we had to move away from Beavis and Butthead.
But I mean, so it's kind of nice to see that kind of visual ambition and that kind of visual fidelity from a U.S. production, because in contrast, the Ben 10 series is going on. Yeah.
I actually have that in the news, actually. Let's just take a real quick jump over the fact that, man, Cartoon Network's lineup is getting weird in terms of how samey it is. This has always been a problem to a certain degree, where they kind of we've locked down our exact series we're going to show. But man, it's getting super inbred that it's almost entirely at this point, we've got 11 hours of Ben 10. Followed by 13 hours of Teen Titans Go.
Well, the thing is I think what happened is they discovered the success of Teen Titans Go, and they've really locked down on certain aspects of it as the formula for success, rather than really thinking about why it might work in that individual case and not others. So they're doing the whole adventure comedy thing and taking their old series and trying to turn them into these sitcom style comedies with no continuity, but because it doesn't have the, I would say, irreverent audacity that I think Teen Titans Go has. I mean, I'm one of those people that actually kind of likes some of the episodes they do, because it is really out there, and they try a lot of really interesting stuff, and sometimes it doesn't work, but it often tries, which is interesting to see, versus some of these other reboots where, they've kind of gone for, I wonder who I'm going to be able to ask out to the winter dance, Buttercup. It's just really bland in terms of how they want to do the comedy and the way they want it to be kind of like a sitcom, and they kind of miss the point of the original. They also did not have... I don't think they have good voice actors for some of these things. The Teen Titans Go cast is really good at doing comedy and selling it and being expressive. And these ones, it's not very good. I decided to try to, sometimes I'll go through and I'll just watch a network for a couple hours to see what it's like. And, Ben 10 has popped up quite a few times, and it's really weird seeing them try really hard to tell a joke, and they just, it's really sweaty and bad, and they don't nail any of the attempted jokes executions. And it's, it's not even like, oh, they ruined my childhood, Ben 10 used to be good. I go like, well, no, but Ben 10 originally had like kind of a structure. This is, And visually too, visually they're also just. I don't know who they're going to, but it's the same. I think it's the same production studio in Korea, and it's just spitting out a lot of stuff that looks very visually similar that should not be. They shouldn't have the same, yeah.
But even that being said, like, the stranger thing to me is more the fact that, like, that's literally all they're airing. They're continuing to pay money to have other, cartoons get made.
Yes, and their airtime slots are, Adventure Time is still technically in production, but they don't show any old episodes almost at all. Like, it's not even in their own, incestuous syndication anymore. It's very
like Steven
weird.
Universe gets we have new episodes. Here they are. They have their spike of attention, and they're like, if you want to see the rest of them, then you have to go out to, our site or go to Netflix or whatever it is.
They have the app. So, everyone is trying to turn their own damn app now, and it's driving me crazy. maybe
that works for them. Like, maybe that makes monetary sense to do it that way. Like, I'm curious to. I'm never going to know what this is, but I'd be curious to see, like, if they have some particular deal for, like, Teen Titans Go and Ben 10 such that just the overhead is so low that regardless of the fact that they're just airing the same thing over and over again the entire day, the overhead is so low compared to doing certain other things from their studios that it's kind of like, it makes sense.
Well, it's really weird because Teen Titans Go is actually Warner Brothers Animation. They're not technically produced by Cartoon Network Studios. And a lot of that one's also animated in Canada, so it might actually just be, even though they don't technically own the property at Cartoon Network, it might end up being like a really cheap show for them to show because in terms of animation, they're benefiting highly from the subsidized production system up north. That might be an aspect of it. I think it also might just be a really popular show for them. And they have a lot of episodes of it produced already.
But every hour, though, like every hour.
I know. Well, think about Nickelodeon though. Like, so if we're gonna pull out the sins of Cartoon Network here, let's also look at what Nickelodeon has done. And in the past, they had just days of SpongeBob and Fairly Odd Parents. So like, this is not a specific network issue. It's a general television and planning and decision-making problem that I think is almost just industry-wide. Like,
I mean, the concern with Cartoon Network is more the fact that, like,
they're capable of better.
Yes, it's more the sense like Nickelodeon's been screwing up for ages, whatever.
Yeah, we're just used to it now.
Cartoon Network has been something of a font for like the last few years of like, oh, there's neat stuff coming out of here. Like, Steven Universe happened. You had all these shows that start up from people who had worked on Adventure Time. Adventure Time itself was a big thing. But now even like Adventure Time's not really there anymore. Like, it shows up when there's a new episode, but that's it. Like, I think like the next like
they're
month
phasing
or so,
that one out. So
yeah, well, sure, but even then, like, you would still run reruns, right? Like, is it
You'd
just
think,
that
well,
low
yeah,
engagement these days?
I think. Well, my guess is that. Okay, my brain strategically would say Adventure Time already kind of hit its peak at a certain point, and they have like a lot of ancillary products for it now. So they feel that the brand itself has already solidified itself to sell those ancillary products, which will probably make them a lot more money than airing episodes on TV with whatever daytime advertising budget you get, because showing cartoons on a cable channel at 1 p.m. in the afternoon, who are the advertisers that are going to be willing to do that? ITT Tech, knee brace Medicare scams, things like that. So that's kind of like somewhat empty calories. But even then, because I think the series has really hit their peak in terms of just production and how much they want to really support it as a growing brand, they're not really going to be airing a whole bunch of episodes of it. I think Ben 10 is getting a big push, not just because it's a new series, but because that one has a lot of ancillary products that are associated with it. The action figures and things like, there's a lot of stuff that's produced around it. And I think internationally it does pretty well. So they're probably using it for that purpose rather than necessarily believing in the show itself. I mean, I think when they first did the Powerpuff Girls relaunch, they did we're going to show a lot of the episodes through the day. This is the show we really want to build the thing around, and then hope it eventually becomes appointment television for people to see the new episodes and go onto their online app, or which requires someone to subscribe to cable services. And considering all these people have been cable cutting, it's kind of a way of incentivizing, well, if you want to see new stuff and you don't want to have to sit through reruns of crap to get to it, buy our service or go to our streaming stuff. Because I'm seeing a lot of places are now trying to all come with their own streaming subscription service rather than being kind of a block model where, you subscribe to a cable package with a whole bunch of other channels you might never watch. So there's a whole bunch of weird things going on. Yeah, and then they're also trying to do a whole, multimedia venture. So they want things not just to be, a TV series. They want it to make a bunch of games out of them. They want to make a whole bunch of short cartoons or, various other media ventures related to it. So like you have OKKO, which started out originally as a game kind of thing, and only a series of shorts, and then, became a TV series, or stuff that was mostly for their web audience than becoming a TV series. In terms of development, as far as I have heard, they're looking for a lot of, it's either going to be pure comedy or adventure comedy, and that's kind of what they're looking for, and that's it. I don't know how I think Adult Swim is the one that did the Samurai Jack reboot, because that's definitely not the Cartoon Network model at the moment. I think they have tried with things like Symbiotic Titan or the Green Lantern stuff, and it just wasn't working. I don't think they also supported the shows very much. I think, it existed outside of their vision for what the network is, so they kind of let it dry up and die off like a vestigial member. But I think that's a big part of it. I think a lot of it is just trying to chase an audience that is very capricious and is constantly changing how they consume and disseminate things. Like being. Sure. I think Steven Universe heavily benefits from being the style that it has, because it makes new episodes become an event online, and having a whole bunch of people talking about it online is in itself a form of promotion for that product, and can be used to sell ads and interest to various advertisers and other people, saying like, hey, all these guys are going to be coming to watch this new episode premiere. This is going to be a really prime slot for you to buy ads for us. So,
not to mention with Steven Universe, like the audience with that is skewing not necessarily older, because there's certainly kids who like that, but
longer range
contingent. Yes, and with that happening, that is the type of audience that is more likely to get an app that has that show on it. So
yep,
that it's putting it on the app probably makes to a certain degree a considerable more financial sense, especially in this age of people frequently pirating that type of stuff, which happens.
Yeah. So I'm kind of expecting and kind of getting annoyed by the idea that we're now going to have to subscribe to more and more different media streaming networks, because a lot of shows are being taken off Netflix, a lot of shows are being taken off Hulu, and it's because a lot of these networks are going to try to start forming their own streaming services. So now you have to subscribe to those, and then you have to subscribe to... So instead of becoming a convenience, it's now becoming an expensive, obnoxious nightmare.
At the same time, though, it's good to have competitions with
of course. But if there's too much, it becomes difficult to... Because, like, I want to be able to buy a streaming service subscription and go like, okay, I know... I want to be able to invest in it and know that I'm not going to have to constantly cancel and uncancel and, figure out which one has what show. So as a consumer, it's going to be really annoying.
Sure.
But in terms of, yes, competition, that's great. But the problem is having every network or, smaller ones rather than the power of having a bunch of it in one place. So that could become, it could be both good and bad. And I'm going to find it more annoying myself as the thing, because I don't think the prices are going to go down.
Yep.
That's the thing.
And, yep. I mean, might have to if service literally doesn't work. But if in cases where it's just being added on to an additional service, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine if it gets added on, but versus So
though you mentioning Samurai Jack reminds me that we need to sometime here over the next few episodes we need to talk about Samurai Jack, because that's
we're going to have to. So I mean, I finally watched the whole new season in one sitting, so I can probably go off on that later.
Yep. Also, so the last bit of news I have is there was an article on Anime News Network about a animation director, like kind of veteran from the industry, who's been making he basically broke down how little he's getting paid on Twitter. Just kind of hinted that his monthly income is about $900 USD.
Yeah, and
he's been in the industry for 20 years and in fairly senior positions, just because the pay for anime is terrible, that he basically gets paid $2,000 per anime full stop.
Yeah, I mean, and well, here's the thing too. So we also have to remember that animation director is a different position than we would kind of consider director here. But
sure.
It's still hard work. I mean, this is, what I'm saying is in terms of seniority, when you say animation director, it's a little bit different, but animation
director is still fairly, it's not like a senior, you're calling project calls, but that's still pretty much up there. In the sense
it's still relatively up there,
the,
yes. But
I mean, and they should definitely to the animation directors on work of it's so and so. Yeah, he's got a great style, because that's the person who often drives a lot of the per episode style, particularly in more sakuga works that are more stylistic, but
yes. Well, I mean, and this is not, I'm not trying to necessarily diminish them, but just to make a distinction that when someone says director, they mean something a little bit different than the common imagery that comes to mind here. And of course, they should not be paid subsistence level, wages. And the thing is most studios, and much like a lot of industries, in general, have turned into it's contract work, and it's almost like part-time work rather than actual salary. I mean, I think PA Works is one of the few studios that actually has salaried workers and salaried animators, if I recall correctly, and that's really rare. That is almost impossible to find in that industry. And I'd say even in the U.S. industry, you're very lucky if you can get a union gig. That's increasingly difficult to find. And you're having a lot more outsourcing. You're having I would say even crap like Fiverr creates a downward spiral race to the bottom in terms of wages. And then, of course, in the CGI industry, where there was a wage-fixing cartel scandal that was centered around places like Pixar, it's a really common problem that isn't U.S. or Japan specific, but it's still a nightmare. I mean, I would say that the working conditions in Japan in their anime industry is extremely difficult, and the deadlines are, almost maddeningly short. I mean, and people have to produce a lot of content in a short amount of time, and they're, the skill level required is pretty up there. And they're not really paid well for it, unfortunately. I don't know in terms of, I don't know if this is necessarily one of those cases where it's, the 1% versus the 99%. I don't know where a lot of these budgets go. I don't know how much money is actually made off of these series versus the reinvestment in staffing. I unfortunately don't have those numbers on me, so I can't necessarily make a judgment that it's a greedy system that has screwed them over, or if the support for, in terms of payment and compensation for the production of the series is enough. It could be a variety of different things. I mean, I wouldn't rule out greed because, capitalism. So that's going to be a part of it. But I don't know, where those cuts are being made.
Yeah, it's hard to say. And like the average in the industry in Japan looks like it's around 27K per year for animators, which not good. But even this guy seems to be getting considerably below that average. That's the thing about averages, is that you have valleys and peaks. So hard to say.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like that. I mean, I would say the voice acting industry is very similar in that people go like, "Oh, you got $900 for one day?" It's like, well, yeah, but you're not working every day. Like you're doing auditions for weeks and hoping you get that day's work, and you're often working a really long time, and you're exhausted, and your voice is physically worn out from it, and various things like that. So I think a lot of people kind of, in terms of the public and the consumer side of things, don't really understand the labor and the finances behind the things that they consume. It would be kind of nice if there was a bit more of an awareness around it, because I think, various campaigns and awareness around it, when someone reports bad working conditions can kind of, might have an effect, might have a O'Reilly effect where, people don't want to be associated with someone that does bad labor practices. So, it could be used as a nice leverage point. I guess was what I'm saying. If there's kind of a larger awareness of it, and if there was more unionization, frankly, I mean, a lot of people who get union animation jobs are really happy with it. Like they get bennies. They get bennies. They're so happy they could not die from disease and stuff. And they actually get protections for their labor, and they know across the industry that what their position should be paid, because those numbers are published and recorded by the union. So there's an average given towards like, hey, if you're a storyboard artist on a feature film, this is what you should be expecting. And over the last few years, this is kind of the trend in that average. And that's really useful for people who are negotiating their own pay. So, if there's increased union involvement, I think that could possibly be a good thing. Don't know if it will happen, but it would be nice. In terms of news, I think that's it. Other than I've been seeing a lot of promo material for the Captain Underpants movie. So we'll see how that turns out.
Also, the Pokemon baseball episode was good.
Yes. Well, also just the Pokemon anime is just it's been.
But that episode in particular was very good.
Yeah. So, but in general, the advice is go watch the Pokemon anime. Watch it.
Yes.
Anyway, so let's get into the subject for this episode, which is MTV's Daria. So, let me grab my info real quick here. It was an MTV produced show around 1997 through 2002. So this is definitely a generational show. It was originally a spin-off of Beavis and Butthead. However, Mike Judge, the creator of Beavis and Butthead, had pretty much no involvement in this show. This was kind of entirely its own thing. MTV was looking for a show targeted at women, and this was a part of that campaign. It ran for about something like over 60 episodes, and it had a couple. I mean, they call them movies, but they're basically kind of like a bunch of episodes mixed together. The animation style doesn't really change. It's just a long episode.
Sure, it's a TV movie.
Yeah. For the purposes of this podcast, I did go back and watch the entire series. Pretty much, I marathoned it from start to finish. It was kind of difficult to get a hold of episodes. I had trouble getting the MTV app to work. They had just recently taken it off of Hulu. They don't have the original music in a lot of these episodes because thanks to it having originally been on MTV, they had a pretty nice access to music rights. So a lot of the episodes had some thematic music from hits of the day kind of integrated into it. Now they've had to do sound alikes, which was one of the reasons it took a really long time for it to initially get on DVD.
Yep.
It was a pretty popular series. I think it was one of MTV's most popular animated series for a very long time. And I think it's kind of, when you think back to MTV animation, I think Daria is one of the first ones that people, would think of.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like it's in our case where it didn't end necessarily because, like, with all of the a lot of cartoons we talk about, from this sort of era, they end because it's kind of just like, well, the studio decided to kill it. In this case, it was like kind of more like the creators decided, like, I've had enough.
Yeah, and I mean, they also gave it a proper ending.
Sure, which was, hey, that's everything you could hope for.
Yeah, so it's kind of nice to have something that feels like it's complete. Like having a TV series versus a feature film that is like, okay, there's a start and an end, and there actually is kind of an arc over the entire thing to some degree. We can get into a little bit about how much it actually commits to that over time, but well, let's get into it in terms of, let's start with the visuals, because I think we're going to have a meatier conversation about, I think, the writing later. In terms of visuals, it's kind of interesting seeing something with such thick lines. I'm not used to really seeing that, apart from, I'd say, Mission Hill, which used a really thick line animation style. I kind of like the fact that everything's really iconic. I kind of like the character design. The characters really stand out in silhouette. The problem with the style, I would say, in terms of fluidity, is that it's really hard to animate those characters with any fluidity at all. I mean, considering I think it wasn't a high budget series, it was made, it was MTV's animation thing where they had some interesting visual ideas, but they were never really going to go heavy into that. I mean, it's a vehicle for the scripts for the most part. And I think overall it's competent. There's nothing really to write home about visually. I think its minimalism kind of fits the tone of what they're going for. But other than that, there's really not much to say about the visuals overall.
Yeah, it's kind of a very simple look. You could easily have seen it working in modern day and age with, digital tools. It doesn't necessarily stand out as something that's kind of from the era that transitioned into the modern digital style, because it was hand done. Right?
Well, for a while they also did digital color, and you can kind of see the transition between them. You get a little bit of an awkwardness with the colors, and you get a little bit of awkwardness in them navigating the line quality, but you can definitely see the transition between the traditional and digital over time with it. But yes, a lot of what it was doing could be very, very easily redone digitally for pretty cheap. I mean, again, it was not an ambitious show. You did not have the characters doing a lot of antics. You're not having them do a lot of character acting. I mean, the expressions were not really varied. It's not a visually demanding show in terms of production wise. But that being said, I don't think it looks bad by any means. I think it looks entirely appropriate for what it was trying to do. And again, sure. I think overall the style is very iconic. I think it's recognizable as being Daria. Like you don't necessarily see that style anywhere else. It's not indistinguishable. It's not the Seth MacFarlane, all these shows look the same type of thing at all. So, kudos to it for that. But it's definitely not what the show was really advertising itself. It wasn't it's not the strong point of the series by any means. I think the focus was really on the writing, and I think that's also just where its strengths are. And sometimes focusing on one over the other is a good thing. I mean, I'm not saying be lazy, but it's the idea of being stylistically appropriate. Having a whole bunch of fluid animation at all times can sometimes distract from a very script-driven type of writing style. I mean, a very dialogue-heavy show does not really meld well with, let's say, like, on the other end of the spectrum, Super Jail style animation at all times, because that's just really visually distracting. I mean, I'd say a show like Bob's Burgers, for example, it has, moments of really good animation, but for the most part, it's trying to serve the script. And, I think a good visual stylist understands what is enough and what's, too much or too little. And I think this show succeeded, in terms of it does what we needed it to do. I think it could do a little more without necessarily going overboard. But I'm not going to look for it for Warner Brothers style character acting and exaggeration by any means.
Sure.
Well, so let's get into the writing. And I think the conversation we might end up having around this type of thing is whether or not it ages well, or whether it still has value in examining it today. My argument, and I think we might end up having a bit of a contrary opinion on it, is that I think certain aspects of it hold up fairly well versus other aspects feel antiquated, but the tropes are still so common that it won't be entirely antiquated, I think, for a couple more decades. I think there's some fundamentals there that are still good. I kind of like the fact that, when I watched it as a kid versus as an adult, I was noticing this a lot more, in that, as a kid, I felt that Daria was originally presented as the always right person. And when I watched it as an adult and looking back at it and watching it as a whole, it was seeing someone who was, yes, smarter than a lot of people around her, but still screwed up and still was somewhat unfair to people, and kind of developed over time, and kind of, opened up a little bit, but still retained her skepticism to some degree. So she never it's not like she was a cynic and then became naive by any means, but you do see her developing relationships with other people. She kind of has a somewhat, a strange friendship almost, even with Kevin and Brittany and Jody and people like that. They're not close friends, sure, but as opposed to the start of the series, she's, friendly with them, and they know her, and, they actually don't really, no one really bullies her, which is kind of interesting to see. I mean, it stayed away from a lot of that kind of high school trope in that regard. So, and so it was nice to see that the series had a bit more of an even-keeled approach to the character. It wasn't like, look at this great person who descended from the heavens and makes fun of everybody for being dumber, which would have, I think, made the show really boring. I think it definitely, of course it's still somewhat heavy-handed in certain areas, but I think it does a fairly good job of being, well, fair. There are certain things that are definitely dated. I think its view of college is somewhat dated, like the idea of, the way the high school to college pipeline has definitely changed, especially, I think, post-financial crisis. I think a lot of social media has changed things. The whole, the characters who are constantly talking on the telephone, that's kind of a much different thing. The parents are definitely a 90s. The way they're portrayed is very 90s kind of trope. They remind me a lot of Angelica's on Rugrats' parents, who were also kind of a parodies of that late 80s, 90s kind of go-go personality type. Yeah. So that's a little bit dated, I think. And there's no way that any show could foresee that kind of large structural upheaval of our value system, and a unclouding of our, or at least maybe a disillusionment with a educational system. Like the way college was viewed when I was going through it. The way college, high school to college to job to career was it was an entirely different way of being viewed, I think, than it is now.
Sure, but I mean, personally, yes, that's all true. But personally, my view is less that while that's moved on, I don't think that's the thing that's aged poorly.
Oh no, there's just that's just one aspect. I don't think
that's like that. That's more the sense of like the thing that really has not necessarily aged particularly well is that when Daria came out, there was something novel in and of itself of like, she is cynical. She doesn't like, popular culture, and she doesn't agree with everybody else. That in and of itself was sort of a novel concept when it came to animation or even, the kind of media on television. And that felt fit in very well with like the... And also having fit in very with the MTV brand.
Well, also having that character be female.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, like, but I agree. Like, you're talking about this. I think was almost kind of a response to the typical teen drama we were seeing at the time. You had the Dawson's Creeks. You had, I would say, even things like Degrassi and crap like that. I mean, this is kind of a response to that type of programming. I would say it's very similar to The Simpsons. I mean, when Simpsons first came out, a lot of people said it felt more real than most sitcoms did. The way it portrayed life, it wasn't idealized in a lot of ways, and I think this kind of took to task a lot of the way teenagers were portrayed. So at the time, of course, that was a much more novel idea than it would be necessarily now. But I don't know if that novelty is because a show like this came along and did that, and therefore, kind of ruined it for everybody else who tried, or if it is a generational just the way in which we fundamentally view things has changed. That causes that to age not well.
And I think that is in fact the case. At this point, like, that's not so crazy a thing to me in the sense that, like, that
cynicism.
Character depiction. Yeah, cynicism is like, and to a certain degree, like, we're literally people critiquing animation. We are inherently cynical. Like that what we're doing here is not the thing that people who aren't cynical typically do. But and yes, it's very easy to relate to that stuff. Like, I don't think like the actual core concepts of Daria have dated themselves. Like the very concept, in the most simple sense of like not giving a shit about school spirit. Like, that is a very basic sort of concept. And it's like, yeah, I think that is something that still very much holds. And like a lot of the concepts of like, yeah, well, maybe not specific instances of things in there relate these days in terms of like, oh, that particular thing, that's something that, I have no idea what they're on about. But like the general mean of it. Yeah, like the general mean of things, though, definitely carries through. It's more of the sense
tone,
of like,
I guess.
Yes, but it's more of the sense of like, as a particular point that you're just going to go like, here is the big pillar that we stand on. It is cynicism. To a certain degree, these days, it's almost like, okay, what else you got? Because like at this point, cynicism is its own like brand to it. Like cynicism is what bore out, like Adult Swim. Like, you don't get shows like this on Adult Swim, but Adult Swim is yet again not the type of thing you get out of like optimism.
Yeah, I mean, I would say I would be wary about using the word cynicism in certain respects. I think there's a difference between cynicism and skepticism. But I would say that definitely this show kind of represents the whole Generation X stereotype, or at least the mindset that was going on at the time. It was a reaction, I think, to the 1980s and to the various moral panics, and it was taking a look at stuff that was considered idealized and saying, hey, maybe this type of thing isn't so great after all. So the whole idea of school spirit and wholesomeness, the idea of wholesomeness being, taken down, this iconoclasm of these types of ideas was kind of like a form of catharsis, I think, for a certain generation. And I think Daria was perhaps an example of that, saying, hey, instead of it being the loner, the person on the outside looking in being, shown as being a weirdo, here's them as the protagonist. And I think definitely when you look at the modern day, I mean, you can't turn on a channel without running into an anti-hero protagonist at this point. That's
Sure.
The current thing is the whole prestige television thing is built around, well, it's different because the main character is an anti-hero. It's like, well, okay, that's great, I guess. I mean, I know it's perhaps an attempt at complexity, but it's still somewhat shallow. But, again, nowadays, I think we're just so used to that. It's the idea, and I think a certain level of self-awareness. I mean, you bring up Adult Swim, the whole postmodern, the whole Dada, explosion, and the kind of the mockery of almost everything and anything being kind of a much more contemporary phenomenon. I don't think that type of thing was really, as common back then. I mean, I think MTV was definitely the epicenter of that type of thinking.
Sure.
I think it eventually moved on to other networks as MTV itself became the new mainstream, and when it became the new tastemaker, it became the mainstream again, and that kind of rebelliousness was kind of shoved off somewhere else. So, the idea behind it, I think I understand what you mean in terms of its cynical tone is definitely a little bit passé. But I would say the character writing and a lot of the jokes and the back and forth age pretty well. Like there's a lot of just pretty good verbal gags and some repartee that holds up pretty well, even if the tropes it's kind of relying on for its base satire haven't aged so well. So I think it ends up doing much better when you look at it in terms of the characters themselves and how they interact and play off each other, rather than the kind of the setting that it is kind of trying to deconstruct.
I mean, yes and no, though. Like, to a certain sense, like, Daria, she's not exactly a particularly complex character, all things considered, though. Like,
no,
yes, she's interesting, but in the sense, like, she's very straightforward in the sense that, like, I don't think, like, people are going to yes, that perfect character. Like, when people look back at Daria, the character, it's more the sense of, like, yes, this was one of the first, things I saw where it's like, oh, I can actually relate to this person on television, in the sense of, like, I don't get the optimism that's so, all these characters get thrust in. Like, oh, it's finally a character I can relate to. Fuck everything.
So she kind of served better as a almost like an icon or a symbol for people to relate to, rather than necessarily being a fully fleshed out kind of human character, is what you're saying.
That would be my argument to a certain degree. Yes,
I could partially agree with that. I think there's a little bit more complexity going on, but I'm not going to say it's deep by any. This is not. But I'm not saying it's trying to be. I think, I hate to say it, but kind of like. I'm using a rubric of typical teen drama and sitcom and animated things for that age group as my standard of comparison. And I would say that I think there is a little bit more going on, but because it's not a full-on drama, of course, there's not as much, they have to hold back on it. I mean, tragedy is seeing someone get hurt up close. So, comedy is someone being hurt from far away. So because it is trying to kind of balance these two genres, it has to play a very delicate balancing act. The characters have to be deep enough for you to care a little bit about what's going on within the episode, but you can't make it so specific that you're not able to laugh at it anymore because of that self-recognition, because of that relatability. You need a certain level of emotional and personal distance in order to really appreciate the comedy. And I think that's the balance that Daria has had to make, and in doing so, they sacrificed a lot of depth of character. I mean, you can definitely understand why she feels alienated, and it's not just because, everybody's stupid but her. Even when other people are intelligent or try to reach out to her, you see her kind of pull away in a lot of very subtle manners, or she holds her own moral standard to everybody, even when it's not fair to do so. I think there's a really good episode where she ends up doing a project with Jody, where, this is another very intelligent person, and her conflict is not this person's dumb. It's this person did something that I'm not quite sure was morally up to what I would like, but she also isn't coming from the same angle. She can't possibly understand what this person is going through. There's a racial barrier there that informs her experience that's different. So I think there's a lot more going on under the surface than necessarily you're giving it credit for, but at the same time, it isn't a super complicated character, but my argument would be its comedy is better suited because of that lack of complexity. So because otherwise it can become convoluted rather than complex.
Sure.
So that would be my counter argument here. But again, like I think really what elevates the show and keeps it going is the interesting character dynamic. The watching the relationship between her and Jane change over the series, and her friendship get tested, and I think a lot of it is Daria learning how to compromise with other people. How to allow herself to let other people in. And it does a pretty good job of that without saying, well, you should totally sacrifice your own individuality for the sake of others. I don't think the show has that, that bad of a message, but I think it kind of, it's nice to see a little bit of that at least. So it gives kind of a overall thrust to it. You see her even open up enough to get, a significant other for a while, and they show, that doesn't have to be forever. They show a really good arc of, how people can come together and grow apart and then break up, but not have it be this super tragic thing either, which was really nice to see, is not have, people treat the ends of these romances like it's the end of the goddamn world. So like, and again, there's a certain realism to it that I liked too. Like, as you said, a lot of people, I think, looked at the series and go like, you know what, I could kind of relate to this. I mean, even if everyone wasn't Daria, the way it portrayed high school life, I think, was, somewhat accurate in that all the crap you have to do to try to get into college, all the various pressures that are on you, but it doesn't over dramatize them either. So, and again, I think a lot of the inter-character moments are pretty good, and some of the jokes I think hold up pretty well. Although some of them are like historical references that I kind of like, crap, I couldn't remember what they were, specifically referencing there. Like there's some really strange references to like forms of fascism in South America used as a malapropism in some cases, and I'm like, Jesus, I forgot how cerebral some of these jokes can get if you don't know like certain histories. But I kind of like that. It's kind of nice to have a show that thought they could, hey, we can kind of push a joke like this even if people might not entirely get it. Lowest common denominator. What's that? We're not gonna, I'm not saying that every show should be like super pretentious, but like, hey, sometimes the audiences will still get something even if they don't exactly know the full reference of things.
Sure, and it's certainly a higher brow than most of its, kin of that era. Certainly higher brow than a lot more other things of this era, though it's still a show that's aimed at kids, despite having that, not kids, teens,
young,
probably be a more accurate description. And to a certain degree, that's them outright acknowledging the fact that, yes, the people we're targeting here probably are, in fact, more well-read than, other people, that they're targeting that sort of MTV audience, and they kind of targeted it quite well, I would say.
Wait, were you trying to say MTV audience is well-read?
Hey. Of the era, it's not necessarily wrong to a certain degree, in the sense that, even with their experimental stuff that they're aiming for of that era.
True, yes.
They're not going for people that are very unwilling to accept the quality of art. Obviously, yes, you have the fact that people are also listening to the fact that, hey, music, in fact, and you certainly have that side of things. But also, I would say that, yes, MTV's audience probably skewed a bit, more intelligent than other sort of animation outlets or mainstream outlets at the time, I would personally say.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that what the base of your argument was.
Of the time. Definitely not today.
Or at least maybe the audience that they were targeting.
Sure. Yeah, at the very least, yes, that.
Yeah. Were there any kind of characters that kind of jumped out at you as being particularly interesting? I think Jane Lane ends up being interesting for me.
Yes, like she's one of the more interesting characters that, the main characters to a certain degree. I think her brother is kind of a weird thing, as a kind of his place in the show is a very strange thing. Not saying that it's a wrong thing, but the way that they use Trent is so just like it's interesting how he exists different. There. Yes.
Because usually what they do is the object of the main character's affections in a high school drama is this, everyone thinks they're so, it's the hottest guy in the whole school and I pine after them. It's like, no, he's kind of a loser. The show
Yeah,
portrays him as and they portray him as such. There's no idealized thing. It's just that he is different than other people, and that's what attracts her to him. Him to her initially, her to him. Yeah, right. Her to him initially, and the show doesn't have her attain it, and in fact, she grows out of that, which was a really interesting transition. And I think it was a good choice for them to kind of do that, to break that idealism and that was a really, I think, great kind of deconstruction of that trope. The person they're pining after isn't the conventionally attractive, successful archetype. It was this kind of like this weird guy who doesn't function well.
It's also interesting that they don't take that to the other extreme by making him just a terrible person that they're somehow attracted to. Like,
no.
He's not a bad guy. He's just kind of trash.
Yeah, like,
It's kind of
it's very fair to him. He has his positive sides, but they aren't going to idealize him or demonize him one way or the other.
Exactly.
So, and I thought that was kind of a nice approach to it. I mean, the closest thing that the show does to demonization would be, I think the Fashion Club the Fashion Club I think ends up being oddly fascinating, just seeing this passive-aggressive political drama between them that spells itself out throughout the various seasons. I thought was really interesting. The conflict between Sandy and Quinn ends up being oddly compelling, even though it's over the most superficial, awful, dumbass, image consciousness thing as the basis over which their friendship is. The complexities to which they are playing with each other in a power dynamic ends up being really fascinating to me in a weird way.
Sure. Quinn's interesting in that she actually has something of an arc over the entire series where she gets less shitty by the end.
To some degree, yeah. And
not like wholly speaking, but certainly like early on, she is basically depicted as just a huge idiot.
Well, so almost like a serial killer level sociopathy. The ones that are she has a charisma, but she has no morality underneath it, and the show kind of points out that like she constantly enjoys getting people to fight over her. Like there's a kind of a running gag where she will create situations that make people fight over her in front of her, and she's like, "Oh no, guys, don't fight over me!" And then she steps back and smiles and watches people beat each other over her. And it's it's kind of disturbing, and they kind of show that, and they eventually kind of go, there is an intelligence and there's a person underneath here. It's just that your desire for approval has caused you to kind of dedicate yourself into a very negative way. Like you could totally take, that charisma and intelligence and put it somewhere good, and then they kind of show that like, they don't fully solve her by the end, but they kind of go,
sure,
hey, here's an angle in which like you could totally choose to be something else. They definitely, they give her a pretty big part in the final in the movie where she finally makes a choice about like, normally the old her would have chosen to allow this person in her life to continue their destructive behavior because she wants their approval. And she finally goes, hey, she develops the ability to say no and to try to point someone in a better direction, even if that's an unpopular choice that might make them angry at her. So that is a kind of a nice change over time. I don't think the parents really have that same arc. I think the mother ends up being a more interesting character of the two. The dad ends up being very one note.
Yep.
So I kind of found him somewhat annoying in comparison. But I mean, again, it's nice is that he's a side character for the most part. I think a lot of the dramatic and narrative heft when it involves the parents is around Helen, who is a much more interesting character. And they also get a lot more background. Like you get her, her family gets involved in a bunch of episodes, and there's a neat dynamic going on there. I kind of liked the fact that the parents used to be hippies, like the various flashbacks to their life before they became, the prime example of, Reagan's ideal of Americans. So that was kind of a really nice twist on them, is to have them be quote unquote reformed hippies. So there's a whole bunch of neat things going on under there. I mean, I think a lot of this ended up being underdeveloped, but I think if they dwelled on it too much, it would have gone a little bit too dark, I think, and kind of ruined what tone the show is going for. I think they could have done a bit more with the teachers.
Sure.
I think there's some interesting stuff going on there. I liked some of the episodes where they have the dynamic between the staff. I think Miss Lee is a really funny concept. I mean, she's not a deep character by any means. She is one note, but that one note is really funny, of having this person who really wants to, having a principal of a school want to be essentially a tin pot dictator, bomb sniffing dogs and various things. It's something about that felt very fitting, for not just at that era, but I think especially now with a rise of authoritarianism, is an interesting archetype to see around. That aspect oddly aged well in certain ways.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have any particularly favorite episodes, though?
I did like, I don't remember the exact episode number or name. The one with the soda sponsorship.
Oh yes, that was a
kind of weird one, but it was interesting, I thought.
Well, I think that one aged well in the sense that that's still an issue.
Yes.
And that one was it was one of those episodes where it's barely about Daria at all. That one was really about the school as a character.
Though that one was also interesting in the sense that it had, Daria, for her cynicism, is not a complacent person necessarily.
Well, she's idealistic. She has a sense of the way she wants things to be, and when things don't meet up to that standard, she points it out. And the mistake that people around her make is they mistake that for simple cynicism as opposed to skepticism, or someone who is an idealist, but the lot in an idealist's life is to be disappointed constantly. So that was a good one for that. I think one of the best ones that I remember is the Wacky Morning DJ one, where her dad has the heart attack. I think her monologue that she uses to get rid of the DJs is probably one of the funniest punchlines in an episode, because the response after it and the way it's timed out is just really good. There's a whole bunch of really fun, well-executed gags throughout that episode. I think the initial joke or conversation about, can puppets make anything funny has a really good punchline. The radio announcer trying to crowd surf and failing miserably. There's a bunch of just really good gags in it. Even it's not a deep episode, but it has a lot of just really well done jokes. And that for me made it very memorable by just executing those just really well. The timing, I think one of the things the show does really well is timing. It doesn't linger too long on certain jokes. It knows how to sell them just enough. Without also being too manic and trying to pack as many jokes as possible.
Sure.
So certain aspects of it, I think, are still valuable to look at. I think in terms of dialogue writing, there's some really good things in there. One of the good running gags I like is Brittany, oddly, by mistake, making a trenchant remark. She kind of... she's saying the wrong thing, but it's oddly fitting for the moment. And there's even a joke that lampshades on it where the teacher, Mr. DiMartino, kind of remarks upon the fact that, she constantly accidentally says something oddly fitting, even though it's entirely incorrect. So there's a kind of a nice running gag with that. And even she gets some development. Her and Kevin have an interesting dynamic that plays itself out back and forth. I think the show also has an interesting feminist angle to it, which is really nice, in that they actually bring up a lot of feminist topics about, what it's like to be a woman in the workforce in a primarily male-dominated industry. Helen's struggles and how much she's had to overwork in order to compensate for her male colleagues, and so it's kind of neat to see a show back then putting that front and center as something that characters actively discuss.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of a nice angle to it. Other than that, I really don't have too much else to say. I mean, I think maybe I have an attachment to the show just because for me it was a cartoon that I was able to relate to as a at my age when I first encountered it. So perhaps some of my critique has a whinge of nostalgia around it, clouding my vision. But looking back at it as an adult, I think there are aspects of it that are worth examining and looking at moving forward.
Sure. And I don't think it's bad by any means. Like, but at no point am I advocating this as like, hey, you should not check this out. I'm more saying the sense that I think that, time to a certain degree has moved on, and the Daria character archetype is no longer necessarily the single thing that you can pitch your entire work on. Because ultimately, Daria as a work, while you have other characters that are interesting in it, like, it's pretty much all about Daria. Let's be frank.
Well, I mean, it's called Daria.
Yeah, but
So, I mean, it makes sense, yes. But I guess what you're saying is that the novelty of the premise, was short-lived.
Yes.
So there has to be more to it than that novel concept, because once that runs out, then, if the series has nothing else, then, why bother examining it or why bother having it? It's something being a flavor of the month rather than something that tries to be its own real thing.
Yes, exactly.
And I would agree to a certain degree. The novelty of the archetype has been done, and that the sarcastic cynic kind of lives on past its usefulness.
Perhaps.
So I can see that. I kind of wish it was easier to get a hold of. They eventually put it on DVD, but the DVD market has kind of imploded, and the only way to see this show is to go to like the MTV website to find it or pirate it. And even the MTV website is missing both of the films they made. So if you try to watch it on the official website, you don't experience an important thing that feeds into the final season, nor do you get the resolution. So It would be nice if, the official way in which you want to curate this experience should probably include those things. Maybe. So, yeah. All right, I think we have reached the end of examining Daria. So let's talk about what we're going to be doing next time. This is a series that I suggest called Shirobako, produced by PA Works, and it is going to be found on Crunchyroll. I think even if you're a free user, you can watch these episodes because it is about a few years back now. So it is about, I think, 24, 25, 26 episodes, around that length. Not too long of a watch. It's about the animation industry in Japan, and it was written by women. And it has it's a Japanese anime about women that passes the Bechdel test.
Pretty strikingly so.
Yeah, so that is that in itself is interesting, but there's a whole bunch of other reasons.
Well, to be fair, the Bechdel test kind of also stops having meaning in Japan when you have targeted lesbianism as a big thing. So
kind of, yes. But even then, having a series that's female centric and not have a romance subplot and have the characters have conversations about each other about larger things than love life and romance is kind of nice to see.
Sure.
So I think it's an interesting series worth checking out. Therefore, that is why we're doing it next week. I am the dictator and I say so. Anyway, you can reach us on Twitter, of course. Mine is at RYMagnuson.
And I'm Zorak.
Do you have anything you would like to plug? Any new videos?
I will plug the fact that, hey, I wrote something on my Tumblr this week talking about a manga/anime that's actually airing right now. I'll talk a little bit about My Hero Academia with regard to some of its character writing. So if you go to sazerac.tumblr.com, you can see me have a whole bunch of words about the leads of that.
So much wasted potential.
Yeah.
Anyway, so you can always email us at adthepodcast@gmail.com. You could, of course, subscribe to this on iTunes. And hey, if you want a nicer quality audio experience, you can always watch the videofied versions that Zorak uploads on his YouTube. Zorak Goes On. And that'll be it. So we will see you guys next time.